Thanks, Johan. So good afternoon to ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. The difficulty of talking last is that most of what you need to say has already been said by the previous speakers, so hopefully I don't bore you too much. So I think my first slide, God covered a lot of it, is that government has this commitment to support localization and move it forward in order to ensure that we have greater industrialization, that we have more jobs being created, that we have a vibrant manufacturing industry. And government has this responsibility to ensure that infrastructure spend continues to contribute towards localization, transformation, employment and skills development. These are critical in order for us to address some of the key challenges that we currently have in South Africa in terms of our manufacturing sector, but in terms of the general situation that we have in South Africa, where there is high unemployment, there is a lack of manufacturing capability, and God quite adequately explained that we have a huge problem of deindustrialization at the moment. And we expect, or we want to achieve through this process of public procurement, this where South African companies are allowed the opportunity to become manufacturers, to get the opportunity to become part of the process of being part of a major project. I think Henk was explaining that in what they tried to do at the power station projects, which some of the largest projects we've had in the country over the last 10 years, where we look to use local suppliers in order to develop their capability, in order to make them part of the procurement process so that they benefit from the government spend in public procurement. Industrial development obviously is a key driver to creating economic stability, and I think I've already said that, but it also is one of the drivers to help us achieve the 100 black industrialists. That's the target of the government. It's a national imperative of the country. So some of the policies that support industrialization, the competitive supply development program that is rolled out by the Department of Public Enterprises and has to be executed by the state-owned companies like Eskom and Transnet, the National Development Plan, the New Growth Plan, the PICC, or the Presidential Infrastructure Coordinating Commission, designation, probably, and I think all three of us have spoke about designation. It's probably one of the key drivers to help with industrialization, to ensure that where we have the capacity and capability in the country, that those are exploited and used, and that we grow those capability so that it becomes globally competitive and not just nationally competitive. The Industrial Policy Action Plan that the DTI reviews on a regular basis, and then through the Department of Science and Technology, which influences what we as the TLRU have to execute, is the Technology Localization Plan. Now these are all instruments or policies that are put out by government to help with industrialization, to ensure that we have policies that support the way we need to ensure that local manufacturers, that local companies are supported by policy in order for them to be able to participate in procurement, in order for them to be able to become part of a larger supply chain, a global supply chain. And hopefully later on in this presentation, we will give you some examples of how this is being executed and how we are achieving these through using these policies that are available to us. The current situation that we have, and I'm not just talking from what we as the TLRU work with, but generally in South Africa, the majority of South African suppliers are importers with a percentage of local assembly, which is not a situation that we want to continue being in, because it doesn't allow for you to own IP. And I think just spoke about it in his presentation now, is that unless we own the IP or we develop the IP locally, we're always going to be at the mercy of some international OEM or some sole supplier. And it's a situation that doesn't only exist with South African suppliers, but even within the SOC environment, a lot of times we've understood that the IP is not owned by the SOC. It needs to be owned by some foreign OEM, or it's owned by a sole supplier, which are two very dangerous situations because it doesn't allow you to drive your own industrial policies without having to be at the mercy of the OEMs. There are major projects linked to SOCs with international OEMs where industrialization can be driven. Now, I think this is what we need to do as a country to drive industrialization, is to use the OEMs to be able to provide South African suppliers with the technology, the skills, and the knowledge that's required in order to fast-track these suppliers into global supply chains, into the value chain of the manufacturing circles that are required for the state procurement projects. I think Henk's already spoke about the preferential procurement framework, which is amended to give preference to localization. And as we saw in the presentation from Eskom, that there's challenges in the way you have to procure, but you have to take these policies into consideration. But all of these policies drive and help with localization in the way you select your suppliers to ensure that you are giving South African suppliers the opportunity to become part of the supply chain. And with all those policies that I showed you and the slides that God gave you earlier on, the policy or the required framework for localization is in place. But as God said, we need to ensure that it is implemented, that there is compliance to those policies, that we do not allow exemption from those policies, that we do not allow those policies not to be adhered to. And that is one of the things that is driving the behavior that does not allow for the industrialization of South Africans' manufacturing industries to take place adequately. There's a lack of implementation capacity within government and SOCs. And I think that's where we say that we need to scale up so that we can support the implementation policy that's linked to localization and industrialization. The vision is not to localize everything, but to localize where possible. The idea is that we can't localize everything. We don't have the capacity to do it immediately. But we need to choose the battles very carefully so that we create case studies and we create confidence in the ability to localize, so that it doesn't always seem that there's a failure to localize when we try to do the process. Price premium. So often we hear the excuse, or probably the reason that's given to localization not being supported, that it's more expensive to localize because South African suppliers are more expensive than international suppliers. That may stem true in certain instances, but if we apply our minds properly and we look at projects effectively, this is not always the case. There are many instances where we've been able to produce products at the same price that it takes to import it. And we don't always take into consideration the larger procurement difficulties when procuring international from an international OEM, or bringing in products that are not procured or manufactured locally. The situation is that when there's a problem, it takes longer to fix. When there is a situation with a tool that's arrived in the country that's not right, you've then got to find a local supplier to fix it. Those costs are never actually taken into consideration as to what does it actually cost when something goes wrong that's been imported into the country. And there's many instances where we've imported products that have ended up in the media recently where they are wrong, where they don't work. And we've spent the money already, and we've got to fix them locally. So, you know, people have to sign off products internationally. It costs the travel time. We need to build in all of those costs. But by manufacturing the product locally, there's always a ripple effect for a variety of upstream and downstream industries that we must take into consideration. And over the long term, that price premium is actually not there. It's actually more beneficial to produce it locally, because the benefits of localization must be defined as to how much does it actually benefit the country to produce that product locally rather than importing it. And buying imported products due to price has an expensive long-term effect. Because when you need to maintain those products, you then have to bring out international suppliers to maintain those products, which comes at a cost to the country, which comes at a cost to the SOCs who have to maintain those supplies. But we know that it's impractical to localize everything, and therefore areas of excellence must be defined. So we want to define what we see as the role of the CSIR in supporting industrialization or industrial development. So we have industry in South Africa, and industry has suppliers and customers. And there are constant changing demands for industry from their clients. But that influences what their suppliers need to provide to them and what their customers demand of them. Now, at the CSIR, there's capabilities in research and development, modeling and simulation, material development, product development, prototype development, systems and design, technology transfer. And that's not the full list, that's just part of the list. But at the CSIR, we have a couple of hosted initiatives, which is the Technology Localization Implementation Unit, the National Foundry Technology Network, and the National Cleaner Production Center, just to mention a few. Now, these initiatives are in constant contact with industry on a day-to-day basis. So we are at the situation where we are able to understand the evolving needs of industry on a regular basis. And by understanding those evolving needs of industry on a regular basis, we are able to say, can we provide holistic solutions to industry that will allow them to become competitive, that will allow them to produce or to develop products faster, to reduce the lead time in developing products, to have the ability to have access to technical capability that they would not normally have in their own companies, but they do not have, but have access to that technical capability when they require it. And that's the role that we see at the CSIR playing, where technologies can be developed internally at the CSIR, but then rolled out to industry either through the hosted initiatives or through the industrialization strategy of the CSIR. And in that way, we believe that we can help the South African industry develop by providing the technical support that's required through a massive organization like the CSIR, where there's constant R&D activities taking place, where they're constantly changing the environment and adding in new technologies that will provide industry with faster, more effective solutions. In that way, I want to speak about this as an example, not as something that happened at the CSIR, but on another sector-wide initiative that we launched, which is called the Casting Simulation Network. And recently we had to develop a mold for a massive new product that we were rolling out in the country. And we looked at this mold, and it would have normally taken us 8 weeks to produce the mold. But we were running against tight deadlines. And using the casting simulation network that was at the Vaal University of Technology and the voxel jet technology that the DST installed at the Vaal University of Technology, we were able to develop that mold within a week and a half, saving cost in terms of the pattern making, but saving cost in terms of the lead time. That product was developed in terms of the mold within a week and a half, and within 2 weeks thereafter, the product was cast. So the product was developed in Vereeniging, and the product was cast in Durban. And within a 3-week period, this entire project was completed. Now that's using advanced technology to reduce the lead time in product development. And because we have similar kind of systems at the CSIR, like the Titanium Center of Excellence, where we're looking at additive manufacturing, these are all new technologies that we need South African industry to embrace in order to be globally competitive, in order for them to be able to become faster in their development cycles, and not to be looking for designs or for systems from overseas companies all the time, because we have the capability locally. We have the ability to produce those products locally, but we need to then choose those products carefully and understand what technologies exist locally that can be used to produce those products. So just a little bit of background on the TLIU. The TLIU, or the Technology Localization Implementation Unit, is an initiative of the Department of Science and Technology, and it's hosted at the CSIR. We were formed in 2012, so we're 5 years old this year. And basically, initially, when the TLIU was formed, it was to assist with the technological development of the manufacturing industry linked to the infrastructure rebuild program of the country. Over time, obviously, that role has evolved a little bit more, where the TLIU now is more involved in other national imperatives of government. The kind of focus areas of the TLIU obviously is from the energy sector on renewable energy, nuclear projects linked to Coburg and coal-fired power stations. In the transport sector, to the passenger rail program that's being rolled out, the freight rail project that the Transnet is rolling out, and then recently with Operation Pekisa, localization initiatives linked to the marine sector. On strategic projects, the TLIU supports projects linked to the SKA localization, and there's some nice success stories that have been implemented there. Designated products, we'll speak about one of those in a later slide, and recently the oil and gas sector linked to the oil and gas Pekisa as well. And of recent time, linked to the mining development projects, the localization linked to capital equipment localization in the mining sector, R&D linked to the mining sector, and innovation linked to the mining sector. So the scope is quite broad, and we're going to share some case studies of some of the success stories from these kind of sectors. But what I wanted to indicate to you, why is it important for us to localize or to have supply development where there's manufacturing linked to it? It's effectively because as you increase an output of a factory, you influence the industries that supply the raw materials to those factories. And that could be the mining industries, it could be the utility industries that have to supply more power, or the industries that have to supply the transportation to those products that come to those factories. That leaves alone the job creation that happens at those factories. But the ripple effect of that is that everything that you produce at a factory has to be transported. So it influences the whole logistics industry. It influences a retail industry. And as Garth was saying, is that when you see H&M and Zara being the new brands of retail in your shopping malls, you want to ensure that you have your own retailers that are benefiting from it. And if those factories are producing more clothing in South Africa or more shoes in South Africa, then the retail industry will be influenced by that. But construction, as we grow manufacturing, you've got to build more factories. You've got to build more warehouses. So those are important things. So therefore we said, for every, and the study that was done, for every $1 that you spend in the manufacturing industry, you probably have a ripple effect of $1.92 for as the multiplier effect. Whereas if you were just bringing in products and retailing them or wholesaling them, you'd only create 56 cents. So that is the multiplier effect that we need to create by developing the manufacturing industry, and that can only happen through industrial development. This is just another slide reinforcing what I've been saying. You'll see that in terms of multiplier effects, the manufacturing industry has the highest multiplier effect, and everything else after that has a much smaller multiplier effect. And therefore, industrial development is something that we are pushing. So one of the models that we've been using for assisting with industrial development, so as the TLIU, one of the customers we see as being government. And through government contracts, we identify components and services for localization. And in many instances, these contracts that are handed out to an OEM, and most times that's an international OEM. But the good thing about these contracts is that they have a local content value that needs to be met. And most of the OEMs can only meet that local content value by working with local suppliers, which exists in your first, second, third, and fourth tier levels. Excuse me. So this is where the TLRU comes in place, where we effectively work with those first, second, and third tier suppliers, excuse me, where we do a benchmarking and capability assessment on those suppliers, and those are joint initiatives that we do with the OEM, sorry, and to develop those suppliers so they become part of a global supply chain, or they become part of that supply chain and participate in that procurement program. And some of the areas of intervention include tech transfer, and I'm not going to go through that entire list that you can see there, but that's not an exhaustive list because it gets much bigger than that. But what I want to do next is to show you an actual example of how this model was used to achieve a localization project for the country. That's just something that was said by the PICC. In maintaining a balance between localization and globalization, it will be critical to partner with multinationals. So we'll get to the next slide, which shows an actual example. But in terms of advantages for localization, we have skills transfer to labor. A market for a certain type of labor is developed in a locality, which Henk was was showing in his slides with Medupi and Kusile. Financial facilities grow. Industry enjoys cheap credit facilities. Suitable means of communication and transport is developed. There is a stimulus for the starting of subsidiary or supplementary industries, which is the multiplier effect that we're speaking about. The training and research institutes are established around this, and prosperity to communities. The disadvantages are the dependence on the main industry is risky, which could happen in some of the power station programs. Once that project finishes, a whole lot of industries have to be disbanded in that area. Scope for employment is restricted to one type of labor force. Overspecification leads to dependence on certain centers, which is what we must avoid and allow for greater diversity. The dishonesty of few manufacturers has an adverse effect on the sector. We all know about that, and we're not going to dwell on that issue. And labor tends to lose its mobility. But there's a lot more positive trends. So on the model that I had on the previous slide, this is an actual example. The customer, and this was was Transit Engineering and Transit Freight Rail, linked to the 1,064 locomotive build program of the country. And the OEM in this case was Bombardier Transport. And what they wanted to localize was a traction transformer for the locomotive. So Bombardier Transport approached us with ABB and said, how can we localize this traction transformer to a 65 to 70% local content? And we worked with ABB because it was going to be ABB's technology that was going to use on the traction transformer. And through them, we started off with 20 suppliers, and we eventually shortlisted to 8 suppliers. And so the model that you see is the exact model that I had on 2 slides ago, where we start with the SOC on top, the OEM is in that area, and then we start to develop the supplies. And those suppliers went through a whole benchmarking and capability assessment process, where 5 suppliers were developed at a second tier level, and 3 suppliers at a third tier level. And they were given tech transfer from ABB Geneva, skills transfer programs, manufacturing systems, and quality management systems. Now, all of this was achieved over an 18-month period, but what is important is to measure what is the impact of doing a project like this. And hopefully it'll come up now. So the impact is, we as a TLRU invested 9 million over that project with those 8 suppliers. ABB South Africa invested 6 million rand in those suppliers as well. The local revenue for that project is valued at 350 million. The local content value is 210 million. Important to note, we created 55 jobs at a new factory that ABB launched in Al Road. The local suppliers developed with 8. The value to the local suppliers developed is 94 million rands. So for a 9 million rand investment, we're going to get back 94 million rands for those suppliers. But that figure that you see in brackets is what I want to indicate to you is what we call the return on investment to government. Because for those suppliers achieving 94 million rands, there'll be a VAT portion that will get back to government in terms of taxes, and there's corporate contribution taxes, which we value, the total value of that is 25%, which means 23 million rands will come back to government in terms of taxes. So for a 9 million rand investment, we're putting 23 million rand back. But important for us is that this is industrial development. And the local jobs created were 150. But the cherry on top of all of this is that those suppliers were now introduced onto the global supply chain of ABB. And is it working? Yes, it's working. Because one of those suppliers has already received orders for transformer windings from a supplier in Brazil, where they're now going to supply over 1,000 transformer windings to a company in Brazil. So the model can work, but once again, this kind of model needs to be scaled up in order for us to achieve greater industrialization like this. There's another example here of a company called Bell Equipment. Bell Equipment is a manufacturer of yellow goods based in Richards Bay in KZN. In the South African context, it's a large company. In the global context, it's a small company. But it possesses the R&D capability, it possesses the capability to manufacture locally. But because it's small compared to its competitors internationally, how do we protect a company like this when we start to procure mining capital equipment, when we start to procure agricultural equipment? And this is what I was alluding to earlier on, is that we need to identify where our areas of excellence, where our areas exist, where we have the capability, and we need to create some sort of protection in those industries so that we procure locally from those suppliers, that there is some sort of preferential procurement, because that will drive industrial development in the country. Because we have the capability, we must nurture that capability, because the upstream and downstream effects of having supplies like that and them giving out work to foundries, giving out work to paint suppliers, giving out work to other fabrication companies becomes a reality if we can procure locally. I think that is my last slide. Thank you. Oh, sorry, there's one more. I forgot about this slide. This is actually another project that we did as a localization project. What you see there is a transformer valve. We were procuring these transformer valves from outside the country, and as from Garth's presentation, you'll remember that transformers are actually a designated item. And we worked together with the CSIR, the Material Science Division of the CSIR, to develop this valve internally at the CSIR with a company called PAL Technologies, which is a 100% South African-owned company. These valves were developed locally, tested locally, and have now been approved by Eskom. So yes, these valves are approved by Eskom and being used in the transformer industry. The project only cost, is valued at 1.4 million rands worth of investment, but PowerTech requires already 1,000 valves to be produced for them. I don't have the quantity, I haven't quantified the value of that, but effectively we have the ability to produce this valve locally that is being imported. And the OEMs that have already indicated that will take these valves are PowerTech Transformers. ABB have already signed up a deal, and Actim are now looking at this as well to procure these valves locally. Eskom have approved it, so we know that Eskom will not have a problem with it. So it links to the designation process because valves is a designated sector, but it also links to procurement linked to CSDP, because I know valves is on the Eskom CSDP list. So it's a success story, but it's one success story. We need to grow these success stories in order to achieve industrial development. Thank you.